Welcome to the Alliance series of webinars. Today we'll talk about the voluntary targets for road safety and victim support that the UN recently approved. Back in November 2017, last year, the United Nations member states reached consensus on a comprehensive set of global performance targets to measure progress and address road safety key risk areas. It includes 12 performance targets that altogether work towards reducing road deaths and are aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. It is the member states' responsibility to meet these targets, but Alliance member NGOs have, at their country level, an important role to play in supporting delivery, monitor progress, and holding their governments to account. But what are these targets and what do they mean? Why are they important, and how can you work with them as an NGO? We have developed a webinar series of 3, and which try to address those questions and aim to show simple activities that can support delivery, monitor progress, and overall contribute meaningfully to achieving the Sustainable Development Goal. In this webinar, we'll give you an introduction to global road safety targets. This is done by the World Health Organization, WHO, who will give you an introduction to what the global road safety performance targets and indicators are, what they mean, and how they are important to NGOs, and how WHO see the role of NGOs. Should you wish to learn more, we have collected a number of resources for you to explore further. You can find them on our website, which is shown here. This is also where you've put your questions or evaluate the webinars. I'd like to welcome you, Jan Chan, who is the coordinator from WHO. He's the coordinator of unintentional injury prevention. And Jan, would you please give us an outline of what these voluntary global performance targets for road safety, what they are?
Thank you, Lotte. Good morning, everyone. My name is Nan Tran, and as Lotte has said, I am the coordinator for the Unintentional Injury Prevention Unit here at WHO HQ in Geneva, Switzerland. And what I would like to speak to you today is about the voluntary global performance targets for road safety risk factors and service delivery mechanisms, which were agreed upon by member states in November of 2017. I would like to talk briefly about the rationale for why the targets were established, and then go through each of the individual 12 targets. And then at the end, I'd like to perhaps suggest some ways in which these targets can be of use to civil society organizations and other organizations that are working in the field of road safety, and how these targets can be used by various actors to advance this important agenda. So as I mentioned, the voluntary global performance targets for road safety risk factors and service delivery mechanisms, and I'll refer to them simply as the global targets from here on out to simplify a bit, were agreed upon by member states following a formal consultation that took place on the 20th and the 21st of November in 2017 here in Geneva, Switzerland. These targets provide an operational framework to guide country actions to achieve the reductions in overall mortality that is being called for by the SDG. And very importantly, they have a time frame of 2030, which provides a little bit more time to achieve and implement many of these activities. The mandate for this work actually originated at the Brasilia meeting, high-level meeting, and in the Brasilia declaration, there was a call for the establishment of targets to help member states and the global community move towards the establishment, the achievement of the SDGs. And this mandate was reiterated in a UN General Assembly resolution, A7260, as well as in a World Health Assembly resolution. And in that resolution, member states requested WHO, in collaboration with other United Nations agencies and the United Nations regional commissions, to continue facilitating a transparent, sustainable, and participatory process with all stakeholders to assist interested countries to develop voluntary global performance targets on key risk factors and service delivery mechanisms to reduce road traffic fatalities and injuries. So the question is, why do we need these global targets? Well, the first answer is these global targets provide an operational framework to guide member states and other actors to work towards the SDGs. As you know, there are two SDG targets that are relevant for road safety. The first is SDG target 3.6, which calls for a reduction by 50% of all deaths and injuries from road traffic injuries by 2020, which is only a few years away. And the second is SDG target 11.2, which calls for greater access to safe, affordable, and accessible sustainable transport systems for all. And what's important about this is that they provide a broader goal that countries need to work towards. What they don't specify are the specific actions that need to be put into place or implemented in order to achieve a overall reduction in deaths and injuries. And that's what these targets do. They provide 12 specific targets which essentially guide countries to act in 12 areas in order to reach this overall reduction in deaths. At the global level, these targets can also be used to raise awareness of road safety, and it also allows us to continue to assess progress towards the Decade of Action and the Sustainable Development Goal. At the national level, it will enable countries to keep more focused action, especially where the results are being made public, and it allows for monitoring and adjustment of activities and actions as needed. So in developing these targets, WHO, along with UN partners, considered a number of criteria that were used in order to identify targets that would be appropriate. These criteria are listed here, and I'll go through them. The first was high epidemiologic and public health relevance. That is, a strong causal links between what could be targeted and what could be seen as a reduction in the overall number of deaths or injuries. Evidence driven, that is, the targets were based on interventions that we know were to be effective and that have been effective. And similar to this point, that we chose interventions where there was evidence of effectiveness and feasibility. In addition to that, we also looked at interventions that were achievable, those that could be measured, as well as those could be easily targets that could be easily communicated. And most importantly, we chose to look at targets that were time-bound. As you can see, the process of developing these global targets took over about 2 years, starting with the initial declaration in Brasilia in 2015, following with the UN General Assembly resolution and the WHO resolution as well. Following this, the initial work to draft the discussion paper by the Secretariat took place between October and December of 2016. An early draft of the discussion paper was then released in January of 2017. And between January and May of 2017, a series of consultations took place. And these included online consultations as well as in-person consultations with various stakeholder groups. Following this set of consultations, the discussion paper was revised by the Secretariat and then released again in August of 2017. Following the release of this paper, the Secretariat convened regional committee meetings as well as a formal member state consultation which took place in November of 2017. And it was at that consultation that member states agreed to the set of 12 targets that you have before you today. Since that time, between January and February, the Secretariat has been working also to develop a set of indicators to support these targets. And those indicators are now complete and will be shared shortly as well. At this stage, we are now preparing for a UN General Assembly resolution which will welcome these targets, and the hope after this is that member states will then begin the process of adopting national targets based on these global targets and implement the suggested actions that are proposed in the indicators document. So at this time, I'd like to go through each of the 12 targets that have been agreed upon. The first target, by 2020, all countries have established a comprehensive multisectoral national road safety action plan with time-bound targets. I know this will be the topic of a subsequent webinar, so I won't go into it. But the idea for this target was that as a first step in implementing work towards improving road safety in countries, member states need to first and foremost have a national road safety action plan that is not only time-bound, but it's also funded. And this was seen as a critical first step towards making progress towards the SDGs and implementing road safety actions. And for that reason, the target was set at 2020 with a timeline of 2020 instead of 2030, because it was considered so important that it couldn't wait. And that is, if we waited until 2030 to do this, then all of the subsequent actions would be delayed as well. So for this reason, this target was set for 2020. Target number 2, all countries by 2030 accede to one or more of the core road safety related UN legal instruments. So there have been a number of, over the last 50 years, there have been a number of important road safety UN conventions that relate to road safety. And the idea behind this target was that countries should take advantage of what is already in place, and rather than to reinvent the wheel or do new things, they should first and foremost see which one of these legal instruments, UN legal instruments, are relevant to their situation and accede to these conventions as a first step. Target number 3. By 2030, all new roads achieve technical standards for road users that take into account road safety or 3-star or better. This target speaks to the need to improve infrastructure, and specifically the need to improve new roads that are being built. The idea here is that roads should not only be designed or have standards that enable efficient transport or movement of cars and other motorized vehicles, but that they should also be designed in a way that ensures the safety and protection of all road users. So, for example, if we have roads that are well designed and are safe, they should have places for pedestrians to walk. They should have places for pedestrians to cross. Many times, road standards only speak to the efficiency of moving cars and motorized transports. And the idea here is to suggest that roads should take into account all road users. And this is what the idea of the 3-star rating is about. It really refers to the International Road Assessment Program, or IRAP, which actually ranks the quality of roads, or according to how well it addresses the needs of all road users. And the 3-star is a sort of a minimum standard that we're advocating countries to strive for. Slide number 4 also refers to travel on roads and the need to improve road infrastructure. And here it's talking specifically about roads that are already in place. And the idea here is that roads that there should be technical standards or regulations to that apply to existing roads. And that means that countries should apply these standards and improve or make modifications to existing roads, so that 75% of travel on existing roads should be on roads where the technical standards take into account the road safety and well-being for all road users. So it's a similar target as number 3, but it's referring specifically to existing roads. Target number 5 refers to vehicle standards and the need to improve vehicle standards so that new and used vehicles meet priority UN regulations, global technical regulations, or other equivalent recognized national performance regulations. And the idea here is that all new cars that are being sold in countries should meet these standards, but also that all used vehicles should meet these standards. And the reason why reference to both new and used is to ensure that when we talk about used vehicles, oftentimes we see new cars in high-income countries meeting standards, and then used cars that no longer meet those standards often get shipped to Africa or other countries. And the point here is that we should not be doing this, and when we are importing or exporting used cars or used vehicles to other settings, that those used vehicles should also meet the same safety standards as new vehicles. The importance of this target applies not only to drivers and other occupants of motorized vehicles, but also to pedestrians and other road users as well, because more and more we are recognizing the importance of having, for example, bumpers on cars that are softer, so that if there is a collision whereby a pedestrian is involved, the impact on that pedestrian is less severe. The next 6 targets speak to safer road users, and they speak to specific risk factors that are known to contribute to road traffic fatalities and deaths. Number 6 talks to the need by 2030 to have the proportion of vehicles traveling over the posted speed limit and achieve a reduction in speed-related injuries and fatalities. As we all know, speed is a major cause of crashes and deaths from road traffic collisions. And therefore, one of the first things that we need to ensure is that there are laws in place to set speed limits and that there is adequate enforcement for these laws. Target number 7 refers specifically to the need to increase by 2030 the proportion of motorcycle riders correctly using standard helmets, and to ensure that this number is close to 100%. Member states were quite clear that this should be a priority in countries where the number of motorcyclists or people using motorcycles as a primary mode of transport is high. And the reason why the 100% was established as a target was because member states felt like there should be no reason why this should not be achieved now, and that there is helmets that have been tailored to the needs of different environments that are available. And we know that this is feasible, that in countries where we have seen good laws and good enforcement, that the rates of helmet usage has gone up quite high, and in some cases they have reached and maintained almost 100% use. So this is something that is feasible, and member states felt like this should be something that we set to 100%, and that's why they've made that target. Target number 8, by 2030, increase the proportion of motor vehicle occupants using safety belts and or standard child restraint systems to close to 100%. It's important to note that with this target, the actions that are required is not just about changing the behaviors of vehicle occupants and drivers. In fact, we know that in many instances, vehicle standards or vehicles are not equipped with seat belts. So the purpose of this target is to call attention both to the behaviors of individuals, that is to get them to use and get accustomed to using seat belts, but it's also speaking to the need to improve vehicle standards so that vehicles are equipped with the seat belts and that they are functional. So we know that in many instances this is not the case, and the idea here is to remind countries to continue to enforce these standards so that vehicles do have the seat belts and that child restraint systems are available for those that need them. Target number 9. By 2030, have the number of road traffic injuries and fatalities related to drivers using alcohol and or achieve a reduction in those related to other psychoactive substances. So we already know that alcohol is a major cause of crash, injury, and deaths among motorists. What we also are seeing more and more, however, is a rise in the number of crashes and deaths resulting from the use of other psychoactive substances. And this includes both illicit drugs as well as the abuse of prescription drugs. And that's why this target has been established, is to call attention to the need to monitor not only the ongoing risks that are associated with drivers using alcohol, but increasingly, for example, in the United States and in Canada, where marijuana is becoming legalized, there will be a need to monitor and ensure that laws are in place to govern how drivers who are under the influence of such drugs are treated, and the need to control that. Target number 10, by 2030, all countries have national laws to restrict or prohibit the use of mobile phones while driving. We all know that distracted driving is becoming an increasing risk for crash and injury and fatality. And the idea here is to make sure that there are laws that are in place that are appropriate. And mobile phone, the use of mobile phone refers not only to speaking on the phone or talking on the phone or hands-free device, but it's really thinking about the range of uses for smartphones these days, people texting on the phone, texting while driving, and so forth. And the idea here is that this needs to be a priority moving forward, and that countries need to monitor and adjust, develop laws that respond to this emerging threat. Target number 11. This speaks specifically to the need to regulate the driving times and rest periods for professional drivers. Professional drivers, this refers specifically to those that undertake long-haul trips, but it also can apply as well to, for example, taxi drivers that often work long hours. And even though they're not driving for 8 to 9 hours at a time, like those that are driving lorries, they do often work more than 8 hours in a day. And because of that, there's a need to regulate, because we know that fatigue is an important risk factor for crash and injury and death. And therefore, there is a need to ensure that there are regulations that govern the amount of time that these professional drivers can work, and more importantly, the amount of time that they can drive, as well as the times that are required for them to have rest periods. So the final target is focused on post-crash care. And the essence of this target is to really encourage countries to establish and achieve national targets in order to minimize the time interval between the road crash itself, and the injury, and the provision of first professional emergency care. And the reason why this target was worded in this way was to allow countries to adjust their strategies based on where they are. We know, for example, that in some countries there is not an emergency number, so that if somebody encounters a crash, there isn't a single number where individuals could call to get help. So in those settings, it may be that the first step to improving or reducing the time between the crash event and the provision of the first provision of professional emergency care would be to establish an emergency number. In other countries, the actions that might be required would be to, for example, establish Good Samaritan laws that protect bystanders who encounter a crash scene and who may want to facilitate getting help. But the idea here is that the shorter the interval between the injury event and the provision of professional care, the better the outcomes for the victim will be. So the idea is that we should do what we can to reduce that time so that it doesn't stretch out too long. And this has been a reason why some of the outcomes have not been favorable in some instances, because by the time that people actually get care or get to professional care, it's too late. And what we're trying to advocate here is to have countries to work to reduce that time as much as they can. So those are, that was a very brief overview of the 12 targets. And again, more details of these targets are available online in the discussion paper that was published a while back. In terms of next steps, in April 2018, there will be a UN General Assembly resolution that will welcome the targets and that will encourage national governments to adopt their own national targets based on these global targets. WHO, in a collaboration with other UN agencies, is working on developing a set of tools and other resource materials to assist member states in implementing these global targets. We are also continuing to put in place mechanisms to monitor progress towards the achievement of these targets. As many of you know, WHO publishes on a biannual basis the Global Status Report on Road Safety, which actually addresses a number of the issues covered in these targets. But we're also looking at ways to improve monitoring at the national level. And this is actually an area where I think that civil society actors such as yourselves can play an important role. More information on these targets, as I mentioned, is available on the site that you see before you now. So I just wanted to end with this slide and to call your attention to some of the things that I believe that you as civil society organizations can do to take this agenda forward using these global targets. As I mentioned at the onset, I think that the targets are quite important for global advocacy, generally speaking. There is a need for us to ensure as a global community that the visibility of road safety continues beyond 2020. And to the extent that there will be, that we can advocate for a new SDG target or a new SDG timeline for the existing target 3.6, that will be important. And I think that these targets, are a critical part of that process. We also believe that these targets, while they're important at the global level, will not have as much impact unless member states and countries adopt national targets. And I believe that this is where your role comes in. Having looked at the set of 12 global targets, you will probably recognize that there are some that are probably more applicable or more relevant to your particular setting. And it would be good for you to take these forwards and to advocate for action and to mobilize action around these key areas of work to ensure that they don't get forgotten and that they are in place. I think these targets also provide you with a monitoring framework that you can use to see whether or not progress is being made in your countries. And you can use these targets, and even though they are voluntary targets, member states have supported them through a consensus process. So it can be something that you can use to hold governments accountable for action. Obviously, I think that there are other things that you can do as civil society organizations to take this forward, and I think that will be the topic of subsequent webinars that you'll discuss on this topic. But I think that these are some of the main areas where civil society organizations can play an important role in keeping not only the road safety visible and making sure that we stay visible beyond 2020, but also to continue to push governments and to ensure that there is action and to ensure that governments remain accountable to their constituents, and to ensure that we're making progress towards reducing the number of fatalities and injuries worldwide. So I will end my presentation there, and I look forward to hearing your feedback, as well as to participating and watching the subsequent webinars on this topic of the global targets. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jan. That was, I think it was a very comprehensive overview. I'm sure our members have many more questions, and we'll try to answer them through our various channels, through our website and through our webinars. But thank you very much for your time now, and I think this was a really good way to kickstart this webinar, and hopefully ensure that there's much more focus on the voluntary targets and how we can use them and how they can serve as a framework for all of us. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nan. This webinar is available online, and you can go back and listen to it as many times as you like. Should you wish to learn more, we have collected a number of resources which you can find on the website, which is here on this slide. Thank you for listening, and have a safe day.